The body is also used to mark out and differentiate people from each other. This quote from Stuart Hall refers to the anthropologist Mary Douglas, who spoke about what happens when we perceive that something does not belong where it is, when it is so-called matter out of place. Our first tendency is to want to get rid of it. Hall discusses this in relation to race. He says that we read the body like a language. In other words, we make decisions about what people are likely to be like, how they think, how intelligent they are, what they are good at, and so on, based on signs that we see on their bodies. So skin color, for example, is read as either positive or negative. People with black skin have historically been seen as less intelligent because we make an association between what is on the outside and what is on the inside. This picture of Saartjie Baartman is exemplary. Saartjie Baartman was a Khoikhoi woman who was named pejoratively the Hottentot Venus. Baartman was brought to Europe for shows and fairs and put on display for Europeans to observe her unnaturally large sexual organs, or so it was said. On her death, Sarah Baartman's body was dissected and the various parts were kept for a long time in the Museum of Man in Paris. So we value different bodies differently. What about this photo of Beyoncé? Critics have pointed out that her skin has been lightened for this L'Oreal ad. Why? Do you think she looks more attractive? Would people be more likely to buy this hair color by L'Oreal because her skin or her hair are lighter? Take a close look at her nose in both of the photos. Clearly, on the right, her nose has been photoshopped. What about her latest transformation as an advocate of the Black Lives Matter movement? How about when bodily signs are borrowed between cultures, such as in this extreme case of scarification, but also in the case of tattoos and piercings, so-called tribal tattoos and so on? Are the reasons for the scarification in both of these photos the same? What reasons would a person have to engage in these practices if they don't come from the same cultural background where this practice is originally done? Is it a case of so-called cultural appropriation? And what does that mean about the way in which we think of the link between our bodies and our cultures? So how we wear or adorn our bodies and what that says about where we think of ourselves as belonging. One clue to the last question on the previous slide is our search for individuality and uniqueness. The sociologist Georg Simmel broke with Western tradition that prioritized the importance of the mind over the body as the substance of the individual. Simmel did not ignore the mind, but he claimed that the body was also important. So this is a radical departure from Descartes' idea that we should think of the mind as being completely separate to the body. Simmel did things like look at fashion and flirting as important markers of individuality that have an impact on how the individual interacts with society. So maybe by scarifying or things like extreme tattooing, people are using their bodies to make an impact on society, claim a place, or announcing themselves, putting stress on the fact that they are individuals unique to everybody else. Simmel thought that while the individual is influenced by what he called an objective culture, so the culture around them in the world, each individual person is unable to completely assimilate that culture because everyone has the power to create their own ideas and to run their lives according to their own rules. In fact, the body may be the only area of life where we have complete control over ourselves, and that too only as adults. We can do what we like to our own bodies, we can transform them with makeup or dress, tattoo, scarify, pierce, lose weight, gain weight, cut, build muscle, and so on. And perhaps in the type of incredibly disciplinary society in which we all live then this remains one area of autonomy or freedom. The French philosopher and historian Michel Foucault took the analysis of the mind-body relationship one step further. Rather than seeing the body as being controlled by the soul or the mind, he saw the soul as being within the prison of the body. The body is controlled, disciplined, and surveyed as a means of better controlling the individual's mind. So he too didn't see a sharp divide between mind and body. This doesn't happen directly through coercion only, but also indirectly. In other words, there are myriad social norms that regulate the body. In other words, there are ideas that are out there about what a so-called normal body is like, to which we are pushed to conform. We police our own bodies as a means of ensuring acceptability in society. In our society at present, this can be seen most clearly in relation to body image. And all we have to do is go on Instagram to look at the amount of photographs of so-called perfect bodies that are shared endlessly through digital channels. Let's have a closer look at body image and how it's changed over time. Look at these three pictures, all of what is generally accepted to be quote-unquote beautiful women. Our views about ideal body weight, for example, have changed dramatically since the 1950s, where Marilyn Monroe, who was a size 16, was considered one of the world's most beautiful women. Today, Gisele Bündchen, in the middle there, earns millions of dollars as a top model. But in Monroe's day, her protruding bones would never have been seen as beautiful, quite on the contrary. So it appears that beauty in Western culture is associated with self-discipline and restraint. Why is this the case? According to Becker in the book Body, Self and Society from 1995, in American culture, and I think we could safely say in most of the Western world, the body is seen as A, belonging to the self, and also as being representative of something essential about ourselves. So how we look is seen as an expression of what we are like interiorly. The body's shape and weight are ultimately seen as a symbol of indulgence, for example in the case of obesity, restraint in the case of a person being thin, or discipline when we have, for example, toned muscles. It's the shape. We can see on the body that you are somebody who has a commitment to going to the gym and working on yourself. So it's seen as saying something about your personality and not just about what your body looks like. People around us are constantly working on the body because it is seen as being the key to our self-image. In other words, it's said to show who you are, what kind of person you are. The ultimate consequence of this are, of course, things like restrictive dieting or obsessive exercise, verging towards eating disorders. Anorexia and bulimia, for example, are very much culturally specific syndromes of American culture and the West in general. By contrast, Becker shows that in Fiji, the person is not seen as an individual, but as dependent on the community. In Fiji, the body shape is important, but not as a personal or as an individual goal. Because the fundamental orientation traditionally of the Fijian society is to the community, the body's shape is seen as symbolic of how much the community cares for you. The capacity to nurture other people, to feed other people, for example, is seen as a symbol of prestige. So how much wealth literally you have is communicated through how well fed and healthy a person looks. Weight loss, on the other hand, is assumed to reflect disruption in the cohesiveness of society and negligence on the part of the society towards the individual. They're not caring for their son, daughter, and so on if that person looks too thin. So we can see that the idea of the body reflecting on the person is not a natural or a universal phenomenon. It's very specific to the West that we make this association between personality and body type. So why in the West do you think that we have the idea that your individual body reflects on who you are? Where does it come from? Maybe that's something to think about in tutorial discussions. In the West, there's an ever-growing market in fat shaming, as concerns about obesity meet opportunities to market people's desperation. The Biggest Loser, for example, is a good representation of how shame and guilt are used to convince overweight people that they are a risk not only to their own health, but also a drain on society's resources. This is particularly interesting in a context like the US, where there is little to no public health care, so arguably the more unhealthy people are, the more the medical profession stands to gain. Nevertheless, to be fat appears to be the ultimate marker of lack of personal restraint, which, as we've said, is seen as highly important in an individualized society where the way you look is taken to mean much more about your personality. So, for example, according to a poll taken in New York, thin people are thought to be happier and more successful than fat people. Fat shaming is the main tactic used in campaigns to fight obesity, for example, in this US ad campaign. According to the psychologist Angela Sutton, overweight people who were submitted to shaming tactics were 2 times more likely to become obese by the end of the study. So clearly fat shaming doesn't work, but it is still very common, extending from medical practitioners to TV shows such as The Biggest Loser and ads such as these to interactions with other people. An interesting article in the blog site ExoJane shows that overweight people are generally considered to be unhealthy and that it therefore appears acceptable for other people to police their behavior in public. And this is gendered also because women are particularly targeted by this, as they may also receive sexist attacks. For example, the article in ExoJane recalls an incident when the author's shopping trolley became the subject of observation, with another woman who she didn't know recommending that she buy low-fat substitutes for her butter. Now, could we imagine this happening in other social situations? For example, would we ever tell a thin person at a supermarket to buy more high-calorie foods? Policing by society leads also to increased self-policing. Foucault said that we tend to control our own behavior to match the expectations that society has of us. The Tumblr site I have linked to below is a good example of how this happens. Go and check it out. It's about people blogging about their own disappointment with their body weight. In Western culture, the body image that we are told we should aspire to is not healthy or even achievable. For example, this image of Barbie's proportions is a good case in point. What are we doing when we give our children, girls in particular, a Barbie doll? What messages are we sending about how her body weight and sign defines her? Interestingly though, Barbie last year has responded to these criticisms by bringing out new body shapes and ethnicities. And so I'm wondering whether you think this is a good way to teach children about varieties of body shapes and appreciation of that variety. The endpoint of Western society's focus on the individual, as we've been discussing, and particularly on the individual body as the ultimate expression of the self, is the ability that exists out there today to design the bodies that we want. As Varga notes, in the era that he refers to as hypermodernity, in other words, today, technology can be used to manipulate the body in a variety of ways. So, for example, the most obvious one is reproduction. People talk about bespoke babies, human cloning and so on, but also for curing illness or for medical research. I'm thinking here of stem cell research, but also obviously cosmetic changes, cosmetic surgery or enhancement, but also transitioning surgery for gender reassignment. According to Varga, The technological advances that we are seeing in this era that he calls hypermodernity curiously mean that we are in fact less embodied than we were before. We seem to be more disconnected from our bodies. So while, as we have seen, there is a greater obsession with how we look, with our body's health, and the image of our bodies that we project into society, at the same time, with the rise in technology, we are less connected to our bodies than ever before. In pre-modern times, and still in many non-Western countries, people knew more about how their bodies function. They could listen to the body and cure it. So there was a lot of knowledge about which plants and foods were good for healing various ailments, which today, of course, are generally dismissed as old wives' tales. Today, we tend to rush to the doctor or take pills and are no longer confident in knowing our own bodies. This is because in modern times, we need experts to diagnose or verify symptoms. And when we look at health and medicine in a few weeks' time, we'll go into greater detail on this particular aspect. Varga claims that in hypermodernity, the spread of microelectronic technology and virtual reality has led to the disembodiment of the body, or this disengagement of ourselves from our bodies. Virtual reality, the most obvious example of this is, of course, the ways in which we interact over the internet, eliminates, he says, natural spatial relations and the temporal relations of the body. What does this mean? Basically, he's saying that the increased use of the internet means that we basically use a lot less of our senses when we interact with others. We rely mostly on the visual, much more than we do on our other senses. So, for example, tactile, touch, olfactory, smell, auditory, in other words, hearing, and so on. So necessarily, the way we use our bodies and the way we experience them and interact with other bodies changes because of the increased reduction of our focus on only the sense of sight, and to a certain extent also hearing. Think about online dating as a good example of this. People in online dating situations rely on the photograph of the person and perhaps the written description, but obviously nothing can replace the feeling that we have when we meet someone so-called in the flesh. We rely in that moment on more than just our visual sense, obviously. As Varga states, in extreme cases, we can even have virtual sex without encountering a living body, thus transforming the libido to an image. So the body becomes increasingly externalized and strange to us with the proliferation of digital technological tools. Nowhere is this externalization clearer than in the possibility we have today to so-called design our own bodies, or even the bodies of our future children. Reproduction technologies such as IVF have enabled people to have children they otherwise would not have been able to have. But as Varga says, they also apply a rationally devised procedure which is external to natural processes. Now, it's important to note here that neither Varga or I are making a moral judgment about this, but it is definitely an observation of the ways in which our relationship to our natural bodies has changed due to the ability afforded to us by these technologies. Debates about the importance of the natural are all around us. For example, most obviously in feminist discourse. So we ask questions such as, should it be necessary for women to follow nature? So, for example, by having natural childbirth free of pain relief or cesarean sections or other forms of medical intervention. Why should babies be breastfed when modern technology has given us good substitutes in the form of infant formula? Our appeals to the natural way, not just another means of keeping women in their so-called traditional place, so, for example, away from the masculine world of work. What about gay and lesbian couples? Should they be denied the chance to have a family because they cannot reproduce themselves in the so-called natural way? The ways we relate to the body bring up a host of ethical questions that have an impact on what type of society we want to see. Lastly, Cosmetic surgery is one of the clearest ways in which technology has enabled us to transform our bodies. We cannot separate this growing trend from the issue of consumption in a capitalist society. We can, by now, buy the body we want, and the body we think we want is the body that is sold to us through media and advertising. I don't think a day goes by that my Facebook feed doesn't advertise to me various techniques from eyebrow microblading to various forms of cosmetics. There's a huge market for work on the body, for transformation of the body, be it just through makeup or more permanent means. The same media and advertising industries sell us things that are not good for us. So, for example, fattening food, alcohol, cigarettes, and we know all about the debate about whether or not these things should be advertised. So the individual is engaged in a constant struggle between the consumption of the things that create the need for self-improvement. So, to give a very obvious example, I might go out and buy a tasty McDonald's and then feel guilty about eating it and rush out and buy a gym membership. I realize I can't keep up with my gym commitment because I'm overworked, so I may opt for some plastic surgery as a quicker fix. In hypermodernity, we are constantly being sold the idea of the body's imperfection and for the need to individual betterment. And we are sold the idea that we as people, our personalities and our characteristics will improve through the perfection of the body. The knowledge that there are now technological means we can use to fix our bodies means that, obviously, if we have the money, we can have the perfect body. And having the perfect body is sold as the means to happiness. In Vargas terms, this means that we have moved from Mauss's techniques of the body towards technologies of the body, the result of which is that we increasingly experience our bodies as disconnected from ourselves, as something that can be manipulated, perfected, and worked on seemingly without end. So in summary, I've discussed the way in which culture is embodied. We live our bodies in relation to our culture, and our bodies are perceived differently depending on where we situate ourselves or where we are situated culturally. So obviously this can change for people who migrate, and so it's a good idea to think about how perhaps your own experiences of migration may have changed the relationship that you have to your body. Our relationship to our bodies changes through cultures and times, so within our own lifetimes, our experiences of the body may change. This is obviously due to aging, but also, as just mentioned, due to migration and being in different social settings. So what kind of relationship did you have to your body when you were a school child as opposed to being in university? Do you use your body differently at work than you do at home? And so on. The body is socially regulated. So we work on the body in relation to society's expectations of us. And this may, for example, include weight loss or going to the gym, but also dressing in particular ways, or having or not having tattoos. All of these things are to do with society's perception of how the body should be used. And lastly, we've moved from the technical to the technological body. So we don't any longer just see our body as a tool for achieving certain functions, but we also think of our body as a type of a palette or a blank slate that we can work with in order to perfect ourselves and also improve, so it is thought, our characteristics and lead to a happier life. So what I'd like you to do is interrogate these various points and think about how they work in relation to your knowledge of your own society, how this may have changed for you over time, and what you think of the implications are, particularly of the way in which the body is socially regulated on an everyday basis.